A very warm good afternoon to all of you. Today we have with us Professor ANANTA KUMAR GIRI from Madras Institute of Development Studies. Actually, we came across each other. In fact, we interacted with each other way back in 2022, June, I suppose, in June, in connection with a lecture on behalf of Vivekananda Chair. I remember him delivering a very important and very brilliant lecture on integral education. And unfortunately, we could meet only online. So when he came here to our university to deliver a lecture on Satyagraha, Gandhi Satyagraha, yesterday he delivered a lecture in the School of Gandhian Studies. So he expressed his interest to come to our department school to interact with you. So when I met him for the first time physically, I immediately I could feel the positive vibe, somewhat kind of intimacy, more than a friendship. Let me give you an interesting point. I noticed one specialty in him. During my interactions with professors of different disciplines across India, I have seen professors using notebooks, good academicians using notebooks to jot down points. They take effort to write down. Whenever they come across an interesting point from the audience, they are keen to jot down the materials. So my friend taught me this good habit last year. Ever since, I also started using notebooks. So I consider it is it's very important for students as well as researchers to have research notebooks, because after all it's a serious academic activity. I'm sure that from every lecture we will get one point or another. So before I formally invite Professor Giri, I would like to briefly dwell on his topic of discussion today. The topic is titled Rethinking Self-Literature and Society and the Calling of Transpositional Subject Objectivity. Okay. Maybe slightly unclear for us literature students, right? What's the use of such a topic for us? That's the first question. And those who are sitting in front of me may be thinking like that. I think we literature students, we borrow so many ideas from other disciplines. We talk about interdisciplinarity, and more than interdisciplinarity nowadays we talk about transdisciplinarity. That's why we study courses like digital humanities, cyber literature, etc. And we borrow ideas from anthropology, sociology, or philosophy. And we have a professor who is specialized in sociology and anthropology. So that's the relevance. That's the relevance of our session, I suppose. And from what I gathered, from my brief interactions with him over the last 2 days, I could feel that, I could sense that his paper is essentially advocating a break of binaries. Subjectivity, objectivity, that binary. So that dichotomy has to be broken. We have to overcome that binary. And he most probably would be focusing on Amartya Sen's perspective of positional positional objectivity. Positional objectivity. So there are some elements of subjectivity in objectivity. So it's a fluid space. The boundaries are, not very tight. We have to rethink. We have to rethink the old-fashioned binaries. Is being objective possible? Or is it high time to rethink about objectivity? Okay, we all know about T.S. Eliot's postulation. Poetry is not an expression of personality, but an escape from personality. So T.S. Eliot's famous objectivity theory of poetry. So how far can we objective, and how far can we distance ourselves from appreciating a text? So that's a $1 million question. Okay, so transcending the borders of subjectivity and objectivity. Okay, so these are some of the details about our speaker. I have got a long list. Let me briefly introduce Dr. Giri, a professor at Madras Institute of Development Studies. He is a member of a number of professional bodies like the Club of Rome, a globally renowned think tank that deals with a variety of international political issues and has sustainable development as a special concern. He is associate member of India International Center, a well-known cultural and intellectual meeting point to promote understanding and amity between different communities of the world. He is founding honorary executive trustee, Vishwanatham Center for Asian Blossoming, based in Puducherry, Chennai. With an academic background in sociology and anthropology, Dr. Giri has been visiting professor and researcher at many prestigious institutions in India and abroad, in Europe and the US. His research interests encompass sustainable horizons of human development, the dialectics of social and cultural transformations in India and the world, social theory and movements, including Chipko movement, the People's Science movement, etc., etc. Dr. Giri has written and edited more than 24 books covering these interests in his native tongue, Odia, and English. He also has a large number of working papers, journal articles, edited book articles, forwards to books to his credit in both these languages. His articles have been published in national and international sociological and anthropological journals of repute. He is involved with the publication of book series with Shipra, Routledge, and other publishing houses. He is currently nurturing a project called Social Sciences and Regional Imaginations of India, in which he is collaborating with friends and colleagues to co-edit books on social science and philosophical writings in different mother languages of India, such as Tamil, Malayalam, Telugu, Kannada, Odia, Bangla, etc. His multifarious initiatives conceptualized on the basis of self-development, self-realization, dignity and responsibility, creative cross-cultural, dialogic co-walking and co-learning, planetary conversations in a multi or pluriverse have earned him a number of scholarships, fellowships, grants, medals, awards, honors. One of his recent books is an edited volume on Mahatma Gandhi and Sri Aurobindo, published in 2021 by Routledge. He is involved with and has written on the movement in Odisha for establishing schools imparting integral education that aims at a holistic and creative personality development of the individual so that he or she can contribute positively to the spiritual and material development of society, country, and the world. Okay, there's so much to tell about him. Okay, we are really happy, sir. We are really happy and privileged to have you here as a speaker on a very different topic, perhaps for most of the audience here. So, on behalf of School of Literacy, let me warmly welcome you to this program. Dear research colleagues, my colleagues, research colleagues, students, I welcome all of you to this program. So, with this, I think I have spoken a lot. With this, I hand over to the service. Professor Giri, please.
Sugaman and the Vishesham. So happy Ramadan, happy Easter, and a belated Ramanavami. And it's a joy to be together. Thank you so much, Dr. Nair, our respected colleagues and friends co-present this afternoon. And we offer ourselves to exploring together about this theme, rethinking self-literature and society, and the calling of transpositional subject or objective. What it means the transpositional is, and the question of objectivity and subjectivity, let me bring you with a story. The story was told to me by none other than ANANTA Giri, who is the founder of this school. When I was visiting him some years ago, he told me that growing up in his native place in Mysore, so he could realize, he could say that there is the home is an objective space. There is a home. But who sits in the front yard and who sits in the backyard? Who sit in the backyard? It is the women. And he said that as a young boy growing up, I was spending time in the backyard and also in the front yard. And he said that because I also sat around and listened to stories in the backyard, I became a novelist. If I was just confined to the front yard, then I might have become a sociologist. And he said that with all the sociological rules of family and family fidelity and rules and kinship, but in the backyard, the stories revolve around many other things. Not only the issue of husband and wife, but who slept with who else, and as his novel Sanskara shows. So therefore, there is this space called the home. And you know, in literature, home and the world is a very important thing. Tagore wrote a novel on that. And in a way, our human condition, it revolves around home and the world. But what is home? What is the world? And these are issues with which we live together with these issues. At the same time, living with these issues is enriched and facilitated by our journey, our deeper journey and meditation along these issues. And therefore, we are helped by a journey with the philosophical, with literature and literary, and also sociological and anthropological. Dr. Nair mentioned about transdisciplinary. In fact, as he suggested that transdisciplinary is different from interdisciplinary in this way. Now in the interdisciplinary, as it has been done so far, so we really are still much more at a distance from each other. It is a kind of inter without a dimension of entering inside and getting transformed. Transdisciplinary is a perennial calling, not just to sit by the fence, but to enter inside and across. And it is in that spirit, literature, social sciences and philosophy, they need to be part of a transdisciplinary process of learning, or if you like to call it a process of sadhana. So therefore the issue of the position is that when we are living in any field, self for example, what is self? Now as you know, the whole complex reality and possibility of self, as that complexity has been gifted to us by recent theories in deconstruction, post-structuralism, including Buddhism. And Buddhism speaks about no self, anatta. Now the anatta does not mean that it is no self in a negativistic way, but non-self. So therefore, any production of a determined self, whether in terms of caste, class or gender, in who is a woman, for example, who is a woman, what is a woman, how do we understand woman's subjectivity? And you know, in literature, there are many women writers. Kerala has been at the forefront, Kamala Das and others. And these writers have brought also experience of a person who is born as a woman, but is not reduced to the category of woman. Therefore, the things that were taboo, for a long time, sexual experience and explicit sharing of one's sexual desire, for example. Literature being open to that, and not just being like Ananta Murthy's pointed to, that not just being limited by the conventions of the frontier. So therefore, the whole question of positionality is also a complex question. The positions that we inhabit, the positions that we carry, they are part of many complex processes, including all these complex processes are still not totally deterministic. I am born with, for example, a caste position of either an Nair or a Nambutri or a Pulaya, I am born with. But the history of Kerala shows that how difficult have been these positions. Sri Narayana Guru, for example. Sri Narayana Guru was born with a Ijavar community, and his, sadhana, that because one is born in a so-called low-caste community, say his position, his positionality, but he didn't get himself enclosed within that positionality, and therefore he didn't buy this argument that Sanskrit, or to write in Sanskrit, is only the privilege or what the high caste should do, and because we would have to fight against Brahminical domination, that does not mean that neither we should learn Sanskrit nor write in Sanskrit. And that kind of a border-crossing positionality, going beyond the accepted notions of conventionality. But what we find today in contemporary Dalit politics and language, for example, now there is unfortunately not that kind of openness. Because I am born Dalit, does it mean that learning Sanskrit is necessarily a crime? Or not, learning Sanskrit is necessarily a betrayal? Does it mean that? Not necessarily. Because Sanskrit is a language, English is a language. And the danger that comes today, we are suffering from that, the whole Aryan invasion theory, or Dravidian collapse of the positions into a set of rigid deterministic positions. So therefore, wherever we are, first of all, self-culture and literature are not just events or points, they are fields. And they are fields, and they are not only static fields, but they are dynamic flows. And therefore, they are also circles. And it is in these circles, as we inhabit these circles, as simultaneously at points and part of movements, then our subjectivity is born with our initial positions. But when we move across, For example, when as a student of literature, now you may not do what is called as field work. Do you do field work? Not necessarily. Because unfortunately, that is the kind of methodological kind of isolationism that exists. But think of how much enriching it will be. Suppose you are doing a study of a literary work. Today, there are many Dalit writings, for example, or women writing, for example. Now, to make sense of this, what I call as the challenge of life worlds. Life world is a very important thought in sociology and philosophy. And this idea is very pregnant. It can be very helpful. What it means is that we live in life worlds, and these life worlds have their autonomies. They have grown with a sense of histories, but at the same time, these life worlds are also connected with each other in visible and invisible ways. And these life worlds that we are, where do we come from? Our life world is very significant as a creator of literature and leader of literature. If we look at in contemporary India, the life world that literary creators bring, a majority of the life world, most of the writers, they come mainly from a middle class background, isn't it? Most of the writers mainly come from a middle class background. If you do a caste class analysis of many of the writers, most of them would be middle class or middle caste and upper caste, and most of them also would be male. And these people are writing on women's experience, on Dalit experience. And now as readers, we are also reading that. But how interesting it would be if a writer, wherever the writer may be born with, it is not, I have not decided that I am born into a Nambudri family. Did I make that decision? But having been born into a Nambudri family, I am not fated that I would die only in limited to what in Tamil called as the Agrahara. You know, for example, my respected teacher, Professor Andre Bete, who did a study of a Tamil village almost 60 years ago, a village in Tanjore, caste, class and power. If you study his work, he says that because he came to this village and then he stayed in an Agrahara, just ask yourself, why couldn't Professor Bete stay in a cherry, what is called cherry, or a Dalit hamlet? Why he could not just stay? Just ask this question. These questions are not being asked. Today, with the Dalit awakening, this question is being asked at least. And there is a possibility that as an anthropologist or sociologist, if I have to understand the world, then though it is understandable that there is a constraint of staying only in the Brahmin neighborhood of the Agraharam, but then the responsibility is to understand its limitations. It is different from staying in a Dalit hamlet and understanding the village, then it is different from staying in Agraharam and understanding the village. These are the positions. But no matter what happens, both the Dalits and the Brahmins, they are part of the village, isn't it? With many contradictions, but also some points of common space. For example, water. Though earlier the access to water was limited, was constrained, and Dr. Ambedkar had initiated the Madras Satyagraha in Maharashtra around 1927 on the issue of access to water. So coming back to the issue of positionality is that we all have positions as researchers and writers, but the challenge before us is to understand our own positions and also its limitations and try to move from one position to the other. So as writer today, I might be born into a middle class space, but it is a responsibility for me to try to be transpositional as much as possible. And it is not impossible, isn't it? So therefore, as students of literature then, literature is not just confined to study of text or creation of text. If literature is alienated from the dynamic processes of the life worlds, then that literature becomes not so, so living. Therefore, there is a connection between life worlds and living worlds. The whole understanding of the word. Sri Aurobindo says that words have the capacity to be mantras. What is mantra? The mantra is that it can make things happen. Similarly, literary works, when they are written with passion, and they do make a contribution to make us alive, isn't it? They show us new possibilities. So, it is in that context I thought that I would present some thoughts on rethinking self-literature and society, and beginning with self-literature society as fields and circles. And these fields have their autonomies, but they are also part of interpenetration. And both in terms of disciplines like sociology and literature, they have some autonomies, but they are enriched by realizing that they need to enter inside each other. And then this is also related to, for example, how both writing as writer, as well as readers, as well as critics, we can practice more fruitfully a transdisciplinary trigonometry called philosophy, anthropology, and literature. And when we come to poetry, for example, now the poetic itself, now there are many understanding of the poetic where we look at poetry as having the capacity to create history. The great philosopher Martin Heidegger, one of his very important lines is, poetry is not just something, but poetry is with which we are born with. And it is poetry which is the foundation of history. Later on, I will present you some ideas about poetry, where poetry is the foundation of history, but also history does influence poetry, isn't it? So how do we, in understanding the relationship between literature and society and self, how do we move from a conventional deterministic view of self, like society determining self or society determining literature, how do we understand a non-deterministic and non-reductive view of literature, self and society? With this clarifying the ground, so now I can present you some thoughts that I have collected. Now, let us begin with a poem, and it goes like this. So now I invite you to join me in saying this line together. We are thrown into the world, but we are not throwaways. Our places of thrownness become a poetics of homelessness. A spring turning stones into flows. With and beyond origins. Signs and symbols. Our locations become paths of co-realizations. Fates become mutual destinations. A collaborating birthing of potential. Kissing waves of difficult manifestation. Sadhana and struggle for a new relationship, a new consciousness. Then the next one is an I alone, or or is it also an ear?
Or is it also an ear?
An ear of the soul and the other.
An ear of the soul and other.
Eye of the heart.
Eye of the heart.
The implication is, for example, when we look at literature or society, now there is the whole work of the eye. But this eye, if it becomes only observing eye, you know the idea of Foucault, panopticon. And the eye, this panopticon eye or the observing eye has a tendency to produce us as only objectified, observable things. But when we can make our eye also ear, and how important listening is. Now, unfortunately, in modern social science and our modern university, this theme of listening is not enough talked about. Is it talked about? Now, even as scholars of literature, you do take some courses in research methodology. Do you have some courses in methodology? You have. But is there any discussion about listening? Look at where literature would be. The critic. The critic is not just a reader, the critic is also a listener. And on a related theme, as it is the Holy Week of Easter, we can remember Pope Francis. And one of the revolutionary initiatives that Pope Francis has initiated is many things, including what he calls as listening, that how we should listen to each other much more. And transpositionality. Now, as we move from a position to another position, we can move from one position to the other position only as an observer or as a power holder, you know. But when we move from one position to the other as a listener, then my ability to experience life worlds in these positions would be enhanced, isn't it? Rather than just observing, you know, rather than just categorizing. Then, about criticism and literature, I wish to offer a thought from Chittaranjan Das. He is a deep seeker and traveler with social experiment and transformation. And this year is his 100th year. He wrote a book called A Glimpse into Oriya Literature. He writes, the new critics are critically aware. They are beginning to adapt themselves to the new fact that literature is not a special pursuit and this cannot be cultivated away from life, that it is very much a part of life and society. Now, it might seem very commonplace, yes, but in what way we move so that we can really realize literature as part of life and society? And my submission is these kind of practices, transpositional practice, field work and footwork. For example, as a writer, once we live with many communities, like the tribal communities, the Dalit community, the transgender today, and being with these communities, then we can experience not only suffering, but also the dynamics of thriving that our brothers and our sisters are with. And not only, literature is not just a record of the kind of helplessness, but how people are living with a lot of difficulties. And by being with people, we can capture that. Then Deleuze, an important philosopher in his essay Literature and Life, he says, writing is a question of becoming, always incomplete, always in the midst of being art. And the last line is deeply inviting. To write is also to become something other than a writer. Then Habermas, another great contemporary thinker, he makes this thought which is significant in that way, because what has happened, one of the cultural crises of our time, as you know, is around religion, secularism, and the challenge of living with dignity with all our differences. Again, this being the Holy Week of Ramadan and Easter and belated Ramanavami, and in India, contemporary India, you know, the challenges of violence and difference, production of violent difference around issues of secularism and religion. But Habermas writes, an awareness of what is missing, faith and reason in a post-secular age. And he says, however, it makes a difference whether we speak with one another or merely about one another. Because most of the time, our objectifying ways of speaking is speaking about one another, isn't it? But the transpositional subject of objectivity is a way of speaking with each other. And not only speaking with each other, I would submit, it is being with each other, which includes a component of speaking, a component of listening, but also a component of silence, isn't it? Then Charles Taylor, he writes, he is another important philosopher. He has a very important line called poetry as a performative force. And he writes, a meridian is a moving line which reconnects. It is a running through of both the broken place fragments which reconstitutes a unity across time and restores the integrity of wholeness of life, either of a person or of a people. The performative power of language is its ability to restore the contact across lines of fracture and thus reconstitute the underlying integrity. Now, it suggests very interesting ways of the challenge before us, the kind of challenge of conflict and difficulties that we have. But at the same time, how do we accept the challenge of being a mediator? How can literature do that? And if you look at, there was this great contemporary writer from Maharashtra, Ananta Kumar Giri. You might have heard about him. His autobiography in Marathi has been translated into English, but in which he describes his experience of being born into a low-caste family. And then he has also written another novel from the Hindi. And if you look at that, the whole complexity of human predicament, caste and violence, women's questions, rape, gender, and everything, and the very broken fragments that are there. But nonetheless, there are also the challenges of establishing connections. And this theme is particularly significant in literature. I would give you an example of another great writer in modern history. His name is Hans Christian Andersen. So, you know, in Denmark, so Denmark is really the mother of another European modernity. Because the European modernity that we are familiar with is the West European modernity. And all our literary references with that, isn't it? As scholars of English, we study only the British-linked literary works most of the time. Though, very interestingly, I think in the last 50 years, at least 30 years, English studies in India has been deeply, deeply creative and courageous. Some of the important works are coming from English studies. And one aspect of that, many of our scholars of English literature, they are engaging with literature in our locality, in our mother languages, and looking at histories of these literatures, making a kind of a critical engagement in terms of substantive content and many other issues. Like I could speak for the space of Korea literature and scholars like Professor Jatin Naik and others, you know, and they are all engaged with Odia literature, and that kind of engagement, literature and history, is opening up new spaces of English studies in India, which is very significant. But in Denmark, Hans Christian Andersen is this creative story writer and novelist, and one of his famous story is The Ugly Duckling, you may remember, and another story where the king is walking without any cloth in the high street of Copenhagen. Now, one commentator on Andersen's work, when I was visiting Denmark in 2017, I was staying with a very, very kind and deep person who is like my mother. And in her home, I read this book by a Danish critic writing on Andersen. And the English postscript says a few things. One is that the characters in Andersen's novel, now there is an invisible thread across the characters in Andersen's novel. And this invisible thread then reminds the reader of not only the thread among the characters, but the thread that we all share with the divine, or with God, or now we can say with nature. So therefore, this meridian that Taylor is talking about, how do we realize the work of the meridian and establishing connections with many fragmentations, with many disjunctions. Then I have already referred to the need for non-reductive relationship. Poetry and alternative histories and futures, Sri Aurobindo and Jikaranjan Das. Sri Aurobindo's future poetry and how that kind of the poetic, and that future poetry is also an invitation for understanding alternative histories. And then what is also called as alternative modernity. In fact, Sri Aurobindo is a great seeker of alternative histories, his study of Indian texts and translations. In his Savitri, he talks about hidden eternities. He says that you shall reveal to them your hidden eternities. Therefore, rethinking self meaning that we are not just positional and positioned self only. Our positional and positioned self also carry hidden eternities within us. And when we meet with each other, when we move from one time to another time, here I talk about movement, I talk about also two kinds of hermeneutics. One is, hermeneutics as a practice is very important in philosophy and literature. But what do we interpret? How do we interpret? Most of the time we read texts, interpret them, and this interpretation is most of the time is according to available theories, isn't it? So in a way the interpretation is mainly theoretical interpretation. But our life experiences do not become a point of interpretation. The subjective and the objective is an invitation for us to bring our life experience as also an important aspect of the interpretation. And to do that, therefore, we need a new hermeneutics where the hermeneutics itself is not limited, it's not textual. While hermeneutic becoming an interpretation of text, it has been reduced only to a textual hermeneutics. Now we need to move from a textual hermeneutics to a living hermeneutics, and what I call as food meditative hermeneutics. Food meditative hermeneutics means that when we walk across different life worlds, like in a village, we are walking, we stay in a city, and we move across, we live in the Dalit hamlets, in tribal people's lives, and our food meditative, not enough just to read what is written within the novel or the philosophy book. That hermeneutics, when we walk across multiple terrains of our life worlds and the world, Then we move from one topoe to the other. Another great philosopher and theologian, his name is Raimunda Panika, who is born to a Malayalam Brahmin father and a Spanish mother, and we met Father Bhargis Manimala. He is a great and a deep scholar of Panika's work. Now, Panika has developed a very important hermeneutics called diatropia hermeneutics, which means that as human beings we have 2 feet, one foot is in one culture and another feet is in another culture. And if you bring that diatropial hermeneutics to the relationship between sociology and literature, you could say, as Dr. Nair is very interested in now sociology, history and literature, now his feet is there already, quite assured in literature. And his journey to historical and sociology as another thing. But as human beings, physically we have 2 feet, but in terms of our imagination, our spiritual aspiration, we have multiple feet. So I am developing a notion of multi-topial hermeneutics, which means that at the same time, we can have our feet across many cultures and languages, philosophies, spiritual traditions and literary traditions of the world. Because the kind of the literary tradition that we are familiar with, there is a limits of the family. Like we are familiar here with Malayalam literary tradition. How interesting it would be to have a dialogue between Hindi literary traditions and Malayalam literary traditions. Now, if you read Central Asian literature, now 1 year ago I wrote a novel by a novelist from Kazakhstan, no, Kyrgyzstan, and what a big novel it is, and just 100-page novel. The way it is written, and even if it is translated, you could feel, the unique passion of that life. So therefore, this is multi-topial hermeneutics. This multi-topial hermeneutics also needs to be accompanied by multi-temporal hermeneutics, which means that as people who live in 2023, most of the time, our dominant ideology is an ideology of present triumphalism, which means that presentist triumphalism means that because we live in 2023, this is the most important period in human history. As modernity, what kind of error modernity has done? That modernist period is the most important period in human history, isn't it? And who told about it? It is the modernists themselves. As human beings, now, and that is very significant for literature, now because literature deals with language and human beings speak language, then right from Aristotle to contemporary thinkers, we have spent all our energy in saying how human beings are the most important creature of the earth. But who has said this? Tell me. As in a love relationship, the boy says, I am the most handsome person in the world. Who says it? So, therefore, multi-temporal hermeneutics means that as we live in the present, there is a dominant ideology of not only presentist triumphalism, but a presentist arrogant ignorance production. Therefore, in contemporary India, now we live and we really do not have resources, access to our multiple past. Now, many of us, we cannot read our own mother languages. Kerala is slightly different, but I think still the problem of domination of English and others, and then our ability to read Arabic or Persian and Sanskrit is very limited, isn't it? Now, only 200 years ago, Persian was the lingua franca of India. Most of the important texts In India, we are written in Persian, and today we have no memory of that. And as you know, recently, I think a day ago, NCRT has tried to change the syllabus, and what is happening, But the point is that no matter what happens in terms of political ideology, as students and scholars, and as human beings, we have a responsibility not to be imprisoned by the presentist tranquility. And that is the multi-temporal competence. And as critics, as creator of society, if we can experience different time, how it was to live 200 years ago. Just to experience that, that is also another kind of transposition. We feel as if we are living, say, 2000 years ago. How was situation when the Jews came to first day in Kerala? So that kind of a multi-temporal hermeneutics is also the transpositional that we should strike at. Then I would offer you a few thoughts about the poetic, and slowly I would conclude. Now I here offer some thoughts from Chittaranjan Das about poetry. He writes in one of his conjoined meditation in Odia, a book called Ebam. Ebam means end, isn't it? The same thing in Malayalam. And it is a conversation between Chittavai, who is mainly a prose and essays, but he is also very poetic, and Udgata, who is a poet. He writes, poetry makes bridges. It conquers hopelessness by making bridges, by itself becoming a bridge. It established victory over all asamati, agitation for concept, and anamyata, stubbornness. After this, everything looks beautiful here. Once the ladder is there, loneliness departs, and the unreachable reaches us as our very own. Then Chittaranjan urges us to understand the distinction between the language of power and aspirations of a poet. With Nietzsche and Foucault, it is the human will to power which has dominated the way we think about poetry, literature, criticism, and society. But Chittaranjan provides us with an alternative language and alternative word. While the man of power, he writes, longs to bring the entire world inside his closed fist, urges of poetry, Kabira Vasana as he calls it, brings our consciousness to an intimacy when we feel at home with the entire world. At that time, all our fear vanishes. And he continues to write, there is also no hatred. The Upanishadic aspiration of life, tato no vijugupsate, then becomes a way of life. In the poetic words of Chittaranjan, at that time the bird inside comes out silently with all the achieved aspiration and urges of one's life. Once he starts coming out, the door which had remained closed for centuries spontaneously gets opened. And we can bring this also to the transposition. Then the man of power is not able to give himself. He is not able to open his many knots. The knots open and hesitations go away only when we discover the poet within us. For Chittaranjan, poetry is continuous with the expansion of consciousness, taking inspiration from Vishwanath Kaviraj, the great theoretician of poetry. Chittaranjan called this Chaitanya Tanmayata, expansion of consciousness. He has also a book called Chid Vistar, expansion of consciousness. Because with self-society and literature, the challenge before us that how do we take part in the challenge of expansion of consciousness. Though there are many constraints where our consciousness is constrained to be limited, closed, and however. But granted that, still how do we aspire, how do we do sadhana and struggle for expansion of consciousness, which also involves transformation of social structures and behavior. Then he talks about beauty and truth. Chittaranjan believes that adoration of beauty must have within itself a fight against ugliness and a satyagrahic quest for truth. And he goes on to write, those who are only aestheticians in literature are afraid of struggle. They are afraid that if they come down, then they will fall down to an abyss of mud. Then very quickly I will bring the issue of realities, realism and literature. And I will conclude in just 5-7 minutes. Now, we have the notion of realism or reality. But what is reality? Now, creative literature helps us to go beyond a naive empirical construction of reality and suggest radical possibilities in the real by exploring alternative reality with creative and critical imagination as in movements such as magic realism. This calls for further border-crossing dialogue between movements such as critical realism and magic realism, which have not been done so far. Here I am bringing that the perspective and practice of magic realism in literature. And in philosophy, there has been a very important movement of critical realism, initiated by Roy Masker, and that we can bring in fruitful conversation. Now, again, when we are talking about magic realism, for example, in this context, Giti Chandra's study of some novels of magic realism, such as Toni Morrison's Beloved, is insightful. In the introduction to her books, it tells us about difference between magical realism and empiricist realism, and how the former create alternative imagination and possibility. And Chandra writes, the literary technique of magic realism is no more than the known empiricist realism that is familiar to the British novel. It represents reality as faithfully as more traditional realist novel did. The difference lies not in the representation, but in the reality being represented. Their reality, the African, Chinese, Chilean, is not bound by empirical limits. In novels such as Toni Morrison's Beloved, it is fairly evident that the creation of a sphere other than the earthly, a world beyond the material, an aspect of existence transcending the bodily, is vital to the worldview of this novelist. Each of these texts contains within itself the tension between the told and the untold. Indeed, the telliable and the untellable. Often this limit or boundary is negotiated through the medium of magic realism or the evocation of a kind of reality that is inaccessible through more conventional narratives. The other reality takes different form. In the case of Morrison's Beloved, for instance, a sort of utopia community of women, if women is evoked in the oral collective created by their humming. So then it brings us to the question of realism, reality, and what I call as realization. Now, with this reality, then realities, how do we realize? And here I suggest the path of realization, self-realization, co-realization, and it has an aspect of activism, which is a verb element, but it also has a meditative element. So I suggest, I submit, that this kind of realization is a dynamic process of meditative verbs of co-realization and pluralization. Pluralization of reality itself. And very quickly, I will give you an example of different kind of realism in contemporary Indian literature. We are familiar with Arundhati Roy, God of Small Things, kind of, which to some extent is a social realistic novel, isn't it? And the life of the protagonist and the woman. At the same time, now most of the social realism, if you look at, that their whole positionality, the positionality of reality is coming from what I would like to call as the lower chakra. As human beings, we have a lower body part and an upper body part. Is it agreeable or disagreeable? All of us human beings in our body, there is a lower part and an upper part. Is it okay or not? Yes. Now, here one very interesting scholar, and he gives an idea of chakra hermeneutics, which means that when we are creating literature or reading literature, if our only concern is the concerns of the lower part of our body, sex, food, the desire associated with the lower part of the body, of course, without falling a prey to the dualism between the lower and the higher. It is not. In the same body, there is not a struggle between the lower and the higher. But if our reality is only constructed with the reality only of the lower part of the body, but what happens in the lower part of the body is connected to the upper part of the body in multiple ways, isn't it? So therefore, this kind of social realism, according to Professor Manoj Das, and he is a very deep writer, he just left his body 2 years ago, and the Kerala connection is, he was telling me that there was a Sri Aurobindo chair here in the university had offered him, he could not fulfill that, but the Amrita Puraskar, that Mata Amritanandamayi and the Amritanandamayi Mat presents, I think, every year. 2013 was the 60th year of Amma. And Amma's 60th birthday, Professor Manoj Das was presented the Amrita Puraskar. So in a conversation, Professor Das told me that what we consider social realism is mostly, say, 60% sex and 30%, 20% current social contradictions. But what he is challenging us to realize that this is not the only kind of realistic novel that we can be kind of fettered in. In Manoj Das' work, all the challenges of the human condition are there. For example, he has a novel originally written in India called Akasa Sar. Akasa, you understand? Akasa? Sky. Isara means the kind of the sign or the kind of the twinkling of the star. Or like when two people meet, you just give signal to each other with your eye. That is the meaning of Isara. You see how pregnant the use of language. Not only use of language, being with language. And in that novel, once you read that all the challenges of the human condition are there, sex and everything, power, governments, everything. But with that, the novel also works in such a non-artificial way that the novel also gives us a reality of the pull of the higher across our predicament. So dear friends, the subjectivity, objectivity has many other dimensions which, because of paucity of time, I will not go into. But I will conclude with this poem. Here let me not forget to just bring this idea from Elizabeth Fiorenza, who is a very creative feminist theologian. She gives a very interesting idea of feminist hermeneutics, how it needs to have the practice of dancing. And think of that if our reading and writing becomes much more dancing. The metaphor of dance seems best to express the method of feminist biblical interpretation. And another philosopher, they talked about the emotional relational. And like to also not forget just to bring this question and bring about crisis of civilization. Because along with the issue of the lower and the higher, and our imprisonment only in the lower part of the body and society, it is also part of a crisis of civilization. And that crisis of civilization is also a crisis of subjectivity and objectivity. And one important part of the crisis of civilization is the rising violence that is there. And it is in that context how self-society literature can take part in multiple movements for creating a new civilization of love, care, responsibility, ahimsa, and maitri. And now this form, and I invite you to join. Sound, Sabda Brahma, sound divine. Life begins with sound, a dance of vibrations. Religion begins with sound. How does it become only chord? Where is meditation with vibration in the cult of codification? Please sing a song. Oh, I cannot sing. I sing tahleel. You are offering to sounds. You are chanting of Quran. Made the sound of Vedas alive in my life. Dancing with sound in Vedas and Quran. Torah and the Psalms. Teragatha and Jandavesta. Brahma, Abraham, Ibrahim, resonance of sounds. I am a daughter of Ibrahim. Would you kill me if I sing? Aham Brahmasmi. I am Brahma. I am divine. Tvayam Brahmasmi. You are divine. Tvayam Brahmasmi. We are divine. And as there, so this is. And my final point, which is not there, it goes like this: do not imprison me in my questions. And literature is not just a reproduction of research. Literature is a perennial sampling and struggle of questions. As the saying goes, do not imprison the messenger. But unfortunately, in our country and in the world today, instead of engaging with the challenge of messages, we are not only imprisoning the messengers, most of the time we are reaching.
Responses.
So did you complete what you were saying about Alan Roy's book? I thought there was something missing
Which one?
about Alan Roy's book.
I want to say that how I want to say that this whole genre of social novel there, that it is that reality is mainly of sex, of social contradictions, and the kind of transcendence that is there, that will be further explored. That was
And about conflicts
yes.
and not of harmony. We have to be able to transcend that position.
But this transcendence is also a journey in that sense. And there are conflicts which we should not put it under the carpet. But along with that, there are also other challenges that are emerging in terms of transcending from the conflicts. And of course, one cannot just piously hope that it should be. But granted that, in ways of thinking, we also need to document these kind of realistic novels and also the related challenges. With that spirit, I wanted to bring the thoughts of Professor Manoj Das on contemporary genre of social realism. Your contemporary?
Navya.
Please say.
Navya, sir.
Navya. You are teaching here?
Yeah, I'm teaching at the Cochin College, sir.
Where?
Cochin College, Fort Cochin.
So very nice. You have come a long way.
I'm working under Rajesh, sir, as a research scholar.
You are very nice. So you stay in Kochi.
No, I live in Kottayam, sir.
So what do you teach, please?
English.
And what is your area of research, please?
That would be stalking theory. Literature in cyberspace.
So some thoughts from you on these thoughts, please.
No, I was telling you, I had no idea what it was all about. So I was literally confused whether or not to attend the talk. And he was like, you should actually sit and listen to him talk. It would be really useful. So it was great listening to you speak. So.
And some thoughts from you, please, on these issues.
On these issues.
Yes, please.
I'm not authority on this subject, so I'm listening about it for the first time. I'll definitely give it a thought, sir. Now that I've heard about it, now that I know this exists, I really should think about it. It's a clearly new perspective for me. I've never thought about it that way.
Yeah, you have indeed brought in a new perspective. Many were, in a way confused regarding the titles and everything, right? Title of the presentation, etc. But once you started your argument, it was very clear.
Especially with the first story.
Yeah. And you used an entirely new perspective, how to approach literature. In fact, you gave us confidence as the students of literature, the power of literature to transcend, boundaries or positions, to expand the consciousness, as you rightly put it. And perhaps you used the term field, but probably you connect with body, right?
A little bit like that.
So I was thinking about the so-called use. The students of science background, they use the word use frequently. What's the use of literature, right? So I was thinking of the immense possibility of life writing, including particularly autobiographies. Autobiographies in repositioning. The role of autobiographies in repositioning the readings, particularly readings. I was thinking of Gandhi's autobiography. And repositioning happens not only for writing but also for readings. So, in fact, the power of literature, it will help us to transcend the so-called social barriers. I am more empowered now after listening to be frank. It was a different lecture, no doubt about it.
Thoughts from you, sir?
There was some symbiotic training to an maybe from
This might be from Malayalam. He's a Malayalam professor.
PhD.
In fact, he had taken an anticipated way that he would be leaving by 3 o'clock. And after 3:10, when I looked at him, he was keenly listening to the lecture. That itself is a clear indication that he won't done really well. He's taking just
but you might have missed your train, so it will be a little inconvenient.
He understood. He understood. Very nice.
Como viene differenza. Lo dico in Madras.
And we have already here, we have already developed more than 2 feet. We are into theatre studies here. Some are doing research in folklore. So probably we need dance. Okay. Probably we need more than 2 feet. We already have more than 2 feet. We are such a department, school. We involves to finance. And such as maybe all these theoreticians, pedagogues, alumnus, their household names. They will still connect. They will still connect. Unfortunately, there are not many students available here. But we all were immensely benefited.
Some thoughts from you, sir?
Sir, I like the presentation, and the questions that you posed were really interesting. And one of the problems that I have is this transpositional subjectivity really possible? As an idea, as an abstract thought, maybe it's pretty nice to listen to, nice to think about, but can we do it? Can we, how far that is possible? Let us, if we think, since Dr. Rajesh took the example of Gandhi, how far, like someone like Gandhi was, or well, for any matter, even like take any historical figures, how far they were, ready to, willing to concede to others' subjective positions in the form, in the guise of agreeing with others. I think most of the time they were imposing themselves on others. So I mean, I am pretty doubtful about it's if we can develop this, it's a wonderful thing. But I'm a bit skeptical.
This is a very important question, and in a way, again, as it is the holy period of Easter as well as Ramadan, both these practices, they tell us about fragility. Fragility. But because we are fragile, we are vulnerable, that does not mean that we cannot make it happen. So it is in that spirit. We are fragile, we are finite, we have many limitations, but still, and we can do make some. Your good name, sir?
I'm Rohit. Rohit.
You are teaching
At least, at least.
Yeah, I'm teaching English here.
He's an associate professor.
Your good name, sir?
Sunil Kumar.
Some thoughts from our friends, please. Some thoughts, కొంచెం Pesara?
So the entirely new topic, sir. So we were so curious to listen to it. Was all fresh ideas. So thank you, sir.
Your name?
Heslin. Heslin.
Heslin.
Heslin.
Villa name?
Kochi.
Kochi.
Yeah.
You stay in Kochi or
For study purpose, I stayed here in this almost hostel, university hostel.
then you go?
Yeah, I will go in the weekends.
That's very nice. Thank you. Your name?
Fifty.
So, and what Udaya is saying that, for example, in literature and history, now history has a tendency to objectify. This is evidence. And then literature, but as you yourself suggested that even in history, everything is not objective. So then even the historical field itself is simultaneously subjective, objective. And it is not only, there are two things. One is history as a field of non-determined reality. Because history, not only one field, histories as fields of non-determined realities. What the knowledge of history that we have is mainly from the documents. But who has created these documents? It is the power who has created these documents. So therefore, history is simultaneously clear and including subjective and objective. And the methodology itself, therefore, has to be good. But one thing that we need to prepare, that subjective does not mean prejudicial. Because in modern methodology, the emphasis on objectivity has been because it has been assumed that if you bring the subjective, it would bring only prejudices, it would distort reality, but not necessarily. Unless, and this is what science has also acknowledged, unless we acknowledge the presence of the subjective and work on our subjective, the subjective to begin with the prejudicial, but in the process of being with the material, we get more different. Amal.
Like the way you presented fascinated with that as well. And the ways you put forward in that first half was something I was looking for the last few months because of my research scope is kind of something which is disciplinary one, which is supposed to do with media studies, cultural studies, and all that. So I need to have a bit of more confidence to connect all those things together. So just give me a kind of understanding of the things around it, especially those things with and I just did also the transpositionality, how we defend those things with Agrahara and those such
Cheri.
and defend those things somewhat always measured media and doing some researching all these thoughts and data from
I'll come back. Some thoughts from you, please. Pera?
Sandra.
Veeda Vide?
Veeda Idukki.
Idukki, Enge.
High range Raju.
Theriyo. Enge.
High range Raju.
Idapalli?
Rajkumari.
Rajkumari. You are from Rajkumari. How is Rajkumari? You are the Rajkumari. Yeah. So you are studying literature?
MA Malayalam.
M.A. Malayalam. You write poems? Yes, okay. You can tell one of your poems?
She doesn't write.
Okay. Thank you. Yourself?
Vinci.
Binati.
Vinci.
Vinci. Sugamana Vinci. Veeda Vide. And Padikkanam Malayalam?
Malayalam.
That's right. So some thoughts?
Yes.
So thank you for your co-presence. Then very quickly that Amal asked about, and the whole way I think it is very inspiring that the department is engaged in theatre studies, and this is the kind of literature, theatre, drama, dance, and the performative comes to its multiple product. There are some school of performance studies that are going on. So regarding this thing, I was just explaining that how Professor Bette, who is a sociologist, who is coming to a village in Tanjore, 60, 61, a long time ago, 60, 70 years ago, he's coming. He's studying the village but staying in the Agraha, in the Brahmin part of the village. And he's coming to the Dalit part which is called Chennai. He's asking questions to him. He's not staying. And it is understandable that at that time, maybe he has reason that he could not stay in a Dalit hamlet. It is understandable. But because it is understandable, that does not mean that it does not raise a fundamental question about our way of understanding. This way of understanding has some limitations. The transpositional would be to both stay in a Dalit hamlet as well as in a Brahmin hamlet. But even now, this is not being done. Some Dalit scholars who are now entering sociology and social science, I have not read a single Dalit scholar who has stayed in a, say, Brahmin side of the village or in a Brahmin household and tried. Then what is happening? The same logic of exclusion is being reproduced. The challenge is, despite it is challenging, at least to accept the challenge for doing both, we may not do it immediately. That does not mean that it is not a challenge for us. We need to bring that transposition of epistemology and ontology to our way of living.
To all the respected ones who are making this occasion auspicious by your presence, everyone, good evening. It gives me immense happiness and I'm proud at the same moment to stand before you here today to express our gratitude, to express the gratitude of School of Letters to Dr. ANANTA KUMAR GIRI. So, as I said before, this topic was new for me. So, it was like, I'm so excited, it was like seeing a great light in the darkness of ignorance. And I could say that you give sparks to each and every one of our thoughts. You lit the candles from your great fire of knowledge, you lit the candles in everyone's hands. And I genuinely wish that these candles that you wear, that everyone wears here, would go a long way in search of the light itself. So, once again, from everyone, from the School of Letters family, I express our sincere gratitude, sir. Thank you. And I also thank our respected faculty and research scholars and my dear fellow student friends, and once again, thank you all. Have a nice day. Thank you.
And a long weekend.